So last week we entered into a story in John chapter 4 between Jesus and an unnamed woman. We don't exactly know how the whole conversation went. Like many places in the Bible, we have to read between the lines or just use our imagination some as to how it might have gone. Because in this story, we really only have the highlights of what actually went on. But we do know how it ended, with this woman becoming a follower of Jesus and bringing many in her hometown to join her. We read it this way at the end of chapter 4. Many of the Samaritans from that town believed in him, Jesus, because of this woman's testimony. He told me everything I ever did. Oh my goodness. That really is kind of the heart of this story. And so let's jump backwards just a little bit to last week. And here's the setting of the story again. It's in John chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. Now, Jesus had to go through Samaria. So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. And it was about noon. The well was the gathering place for people. And at the time that Jesus met the woman at the well, not the time of day, but the time in history, the conflict between Jews and Samaritans was deep, and it was bitter. The two groups disagreed about everything really that mattered: how to honor God, how to interpret the scriptures, which then would have been the Old Testament, the Torah, how and where to worship, and even the nature and existence of God himself. They just didn't see eye to eye on any of those things. One of the groups was mixed race and mixed culture. The other was pure. They practiced their faith in separate temples. They actually read different versions of the Torah and then held to those readings. They avoided social contact with each other whenever possible. Honestly, if we were going to put it in our modern vernacular, we would go, they couldn't stand each other. Couldn't stand each other. So in chapter 4, the story continues this way. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into town to buy food. And the Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. The Samaritan was a woman, and it wasn't customary or even appropriate for Jesus, a Jewish man, to talk alone with her as a Samaritan woman, much less to ask her for a drink of water. That sort of thing just wasn't done at all. And to put it in a more modern, more popularized context. The Samaritan woman is the other, the alien, the heretic, the stranger, the foreigner. She represents all the lines that cannot be crossed, all the spiritual rules and traditions that must not be broken. She represented them. But Jesus crosses lines. He does it anyway. He always does that. The story continues. Jesus answered, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst." Jesus says the water that she drinks that comes out of Jacob's well will never satisfy her. But he wants her to experience something different, something deeper, something life-changing. When Jesus talks about spiritual water, it's obvious, at least I think to us, that he's using a metaphor. The spiritual water that she drinks, he's really not even referring to the water that comes out of Jacob's well, but he's talking about the faith that she drinks from, the faith that she has made up and that her ancestors have made up. A spiritual life and a spiritual world that works for her. It isn't necessarily true, but it works for her. And as I think about that, I think, oh, how familiar that sounds to how people operate today. But Jesus wants to give her water that will do something different. He wants to give her water that is richer and fuller. He wants to give her water that will quench her thirst for meaning, for purpose, for belonging, for forgiveness, for wholeness, for significance. He wants to give her a life totally removed from the one he knows that she is living. The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water." He told her, "Go, call your husband and come back." "I have no husband," she replied. And Jesus said to her, "You are right when you say you have no husband. The fact is, you have 5 husbands, and the man that you now have, he's not your husband. What you have just said is quite true." So here's where the story changes. Here's where the message sinks pretty deeply into me and gets personal. Being raised in the church, I heard this story many times, whether it was in my Sunday school classes or from the preacher up in front. And I was always taught that the woman at the well was promiscuous. She was immoral. In some sermons, she was described bluntly as a prostitute, a fallen woman, a whore, a harlot. such gross and demeaning labels that we use to describe her. But nowhere in this story is she described as immoral or easy. Nowhere does Jesus even call her a sinner, sexual or otherwise, or tell her, as he did to others, go and sin no more. I reread this story carefully and slowly today just to be certain. And it's simply not a story about morality or even about forgiveness. But here is the story. Even though he never met her, Jesus knows her. He says she has had 5 husbands and a live-in. Look, we don't know the whole story that Jesus does. And there could be any number of reasons why the Samaritan woman might have a past, that past. I've read this in a number of books, and a number of pastors have kind of helped me see a different way of looking at this. Even looking at the reputation that the Samaritan woman might have. I don't know if you've ever thought of it this way, but maybe she got married really young. As a teenage bride, maybe she lost her husband. Maybe he went off to war. Maybe he got sick and died, and she became a widow. And in those days, a common practice was to pass along her dead husband's brothers, and that she would become their wife or wives. Or maybe her various husbands abandoned her because she was infertile, or maybe she didn't live up to their expectations, or maybe she was a victim of abuse. Maybe she had a disability that made her unwanted. We don't know. Whatever the case, we do know for certain that in the first century, women did not possess the legal power to end their own marriages. The authority to file for divorce rested with men alone. Women were simply possessions of men. Look, I don't think that this is a story about Jesus liberating a woman from her own sex life. I think it's something much bigger, much more profound. I think it's a story about Jesus revealing himself as the Messiah to just simply a fellow human being in whom he sees genuine spiritual hunger. He sees it in that moment at the well. There's a great deal we can't know about this woman's history. But we can infer that she prefers to be invisible. We see that because of the time of day that she comes to the well. She comes to the well at a time when generally nobody is out there. It's at high noon, it's hot. It is not the normal time for people to interact and have conversations. It's not the social setting around the well. That was later in the evening. She comes at a time where she doesn't expect to see anybody and doesn't expect anybody to see her. She prefers to be invisible, like so many of us, for so many different reasons. But then Jesus comes along and he sees her. He sees the whole of her, like he sees all of us. He sees the past, our past. He sees our present. He sees the future. He sees who we have been. He sees what we yearn for. He sees how we hurt. He even sees all that we might become. And he names it all. He named it all in her. He names it all in us. And then he says this, now see who I am. See me as the Messiah, the one in whom you can find freedom, you can find love, you can find healing, you can find transformation, you can find purpose, you can find meaning, you can find eternal life. You can find living water. And the reason why is because it is right there where spirit and truth collide. When we share in the bread and the juice of communion, whenever we do, this is when spirit and truth collide in our lives. When we remember that Jesus died, rose again on our behalf to give us new life, to give us living water, to bring us to the point of spirit and truth so that we can worship him fully. Isn't that amazing? Till next time. See you.